When people remember San Francisco in 1915, they remember the spectacle. They remember the Panama Pacific International Exposition. They remember the Palace of Fine Arts glowing beside the water. They remember the Tower of Jewels shimmering with thousands of cut glass ornaments. They remember a city announcing to the world that it had survived the earthquake, survived the fire, and risen again. That is the story above ground. But below the waterfront, another story may have been unfolding at the same time. Because while visitors admired the architecture, the lights, and the promise of a modern future cruise working in the mudflats and shallow waters of the bay appear to have uncovered something no official celebration was prepared to explain. Not just harbor debris, not just pier remains, not just forgotten utilities from an earlier shoreline, but metal frameworks, cylindrical chambers, precision-built installations, structures buried beneath the bay floor that did not fit cleanly into the accepted story of San Francisco's development. And the deeper they dredged, the less it looked like ordinary infrastructure. The more it looked like they had opened part of a system that was never supposed to be remembered. The official purpose of the work was practical. The exposition required land. Large sections of marsh mudflat and shallow bay had to be stabilized, filled, and reshaped into solid ground. Engineers were ordered to dredge the harbor bottom pump sediment onto the low shoreline and create a stable platform for pavilions, avenues, utilities, and monumental architecture. On paper, it was a triumph of reclamation. Take unstable ground, create usable land, build a World's Fair on top of it. But land reclamation has a habit of doing something history rarely emphasizes. It tears open the boundary between the visible city and whatever lies beneath it. It forces engineers to excavate through layers no one in public life is meant to think about. It drags forgotten material out of silt mud bedrock and darkness. And in 1915, if the surviving fragments are taken seriously, that process may have exposed something far more unsettling than old harbor junk. At first, the discoveries were easy to dismiss. Abandoned pier supports, telegraph housings, cable conduits, remnants of earlier waterfront development destroyed or displaced after the 1906 disaster. That was the obvious explanation. It was the safe explanation. And for a while, it was the one most crews appear to have preferred. But the pattern did not behave the way debris is supposed to behave. That was the first problem, because instead of scattered wreckage, workers reportedly encountered installations with spacing, alignment, repetition, components emerging at intervals that suggested planning rather than accident. Structures found in one part of the waterfront echoed those found in another. Towers aligned with towers. Conduits followed shared trajectories. Angles repeated. Distances repeated. That is not what abandoned harbor trash does. Random debris has no geometry. Decay has no grid. Storm damage does not reproduce mathematical spacing across kilometers of shoreline. And yet, beneath sections of San Francisco Bay, the buried structures seem to have done exactly that. It was as though the bay floor had preserved fragments of a larger design. A grid, a network, an original arrangement no surviving utility record was willing to acknowledge. The public story of the exposition says almost nothing about this. Why would it? The fair was meant to symbolize recovery, optimism, progress. The city did not want mystery beneath its foundations. It wanted clean lines, reclaimed land, and proof that modern engineering had conquered the shoreline. But in internal notes and scattered engineering references, certain phrases seem to recur. Pre-existing installations, unexpected configuration, origin unknown. Those phrases are revealing, not because they tell us exactly what was found, but because they preserve the moment when ordinary explanations began to fail. If the crews had uncovered nothing more than routine maritime leftovers, the language could have remained routine. Instead, the deeper the dredging went, the more the record seems to soften, shorten, and blur. That is often how uncomfortable evidence survives. Not through direct confession, through hesitation, through understatement, through the quiet gap between what is clearly visible in the image and what is cautiously admitted in the text. And the images, at least in later descriptions of them, are difficult to ignore. Workers standing beside metal towers embedded deep in the bay floor. Frameworks fitted so tightly they seem out of place for the fabrication standards of the era. Cylindrical housings containing mechanisms that do not resemble conventional American electrical equipment. Components so uniform in dimension that they appear manufactured according to a standard no known company of the time was using. The further the crews dug, the stranger it became. Because beneath the expected mud and silt, and beneath the occasional remnants of known waterfront construction, they began to encounter installations that seemed almost over-engineered. Towers too symmetrical, chambers too exact, internal structures too coherent to be random. Some housings were large enough to suggest an industrial function, yet their internal arrangements did not correspond cleanly to boilers, pumps, or cable systems. Others contained coils, resonant forms, and grounded assemblies that seemed built not merely to carry current through wires, but to distribute it through space. That is where the story begins to shift, because once the equipment stops looking like telegraph infrastructure and starts looking like transmission architecture, the implications change. A broken cable can be explained. A forgotten support tower can be explained. But a patterned grid of resonance towers, grounding systems, and cylindrical chambers beneath the bay begins to suggest something very different. Not communication. Power. Not simple utility. A buried energy system. San Francisco, in 1915, was electrifying rapidly, but it was not supposed to be sitting on a hidden electrical architecture whose purpose no contemporary engineer could clearly identify. It was not supposed to contain underwater or sub-sediment structures that resembled advanced transmission devices more than harbor equipment. And it was certainly not supposed to reveal installations whose design seemed in some accounts closer to theoretical wireless systems than to the visible electrical grid of the city above. Yet that is precisely the direction the fragments point. One of the first anomalies the crews appear to have noticed was spacing. Installations uncovered near the Marina District reportedly shared the same geometric relationships as structures found farther off the Embarcadero and in other waterfront zones. Towers, bases, and conduits did not appear to have been placed according to the practical needs of individual piers or isolated shoreline projects. They appeared to belong to a unified pattern. That matters because pattern implies intention, and intention implies design. Towers from one section aligned with installations in another. Conduit paths maintained the same orientation. Grounding structures repeated the same logic even when separated by hundreds of meters of mud and open water. It was as if the workers were not uncovering disconnected leftovers, but parts of a single buried grid whose surface expression had long since disappeared. And once that possibility enters the story, the bay stops looking like a place where random debris settled. It begins to look like a place where something had been sunk, buried, or built over. As the dredging continued, the structures reportedly became more difficult to classify. Larger housings appeared. Mechanisms grew more complex. Symmetry became harder to dismiss as coincidence. Some chambers were described as geometrically perfect, maintaining their form despite decades underwater. Others were sealed so completely that crews initially thought they had struck natural formations or solid rock, only to discover smooth internal walls and fitted components once they were breached. That kind of preservation is not what one expects from decaying industrial remains in a tidal environment. It suggests protection, containment, closure, and in certain cases it suggests that the installations were not merely left behind, but intentionally entombed. One of the most provocative elements in the surviving descriptions is the appearance of what later readers have called transmission chambers. These were not simple metal boxes or support frames. They were enclosed structures with exact dimensions containing arrays of components that seemed organized for distribution and amplification. Some featured coils. Some featured resonant cavities. Some were associated with grounding plates or integrated base systems set into bedrock rather than driven loosely into mud. That detail is especially striking because grounding can reveal purpose. A temporary structure grounds differently from a permanent one. A maritime beacon grounds differently from a transmission device. And what appears to have disturbed some of the engineers was that the grounding systems beneath the bay did not behave like ordinary lightning protection or static discharge. They were embedded into stone, routed horizontally, connected into conduits extending away from the installation sites. That is not a random solution. That is system logic. And once system logic appears in the record, the mystery deepens rapidly. Because now the question is no longer whether old equipment lay beneath the bay. Many cities accumulate forgotten infrastructure. The question becomes whether what was found belonged to a pre-existing energy architecture that later generations no longer recognized. The comparison that naturally emerges in later interpretations is Tesla. Not because the records prove a direct link, but because the structures reportedly resembled ideas later associated with wireless transmission. Towers with resonant forms, geometric coil arrangements, grounding systems integrated into geological substrates, components that appeared built not for wires alone, but for field effects, broadcast behavior, or some other form of energy transfer that did not depend on conventional cable distribution. There is, of course, no official municipal archive declaring that San Francisco possessed a hidden wireless power grid beneath its bay in 1915. And that absence matters. Because if such a system truly belonged to ordinary documented history, one would expect it to have been celebrated, cataloged, investigated, photographed comprehensively, debated by engineers. The exposition itself was a monument to modern achievement. Discovering an advanced buried energy installation beneath its foundations should have been irresistible. Instead, the opposite seems to have happened. The reports grow thinner, the descriptions grow vaguer, the widest views vanish from the photographic record, and the most anomalous sections are buried again. That pattern alone does not prove what the structures were, but it does suggest discomfort. It suggests that whatever was encountered beneath the bay resisted easy incorporation into the story the city wanted to tell about itself. And the structures themselves seem to have reinforced that unease. Some components were described as having perfectly uniform wall thickness. Some surfaces were finished smooth, almost frictionless. Threads and joints appeared too exact for the hand-fitted methods that early 20th century observers would have expected. In certain cases, even the materials caused confusion. This is where the story becomes especially difficult to dismiss. Some insulators reportedly appeared to be made from ceramic compounds that specialists of the time could not identify. Others showed crystalline microstructures more consistent with advanced processing than with ordinary kiln work. These were not raw minerals lying loose in mud. They were shaped, machined, and fitted into functioning components. That distinction is crucial because unusual material in nature explains very little. Unusual material incorporated into engineered devices explains far more. If a strange ceramic appears inside an insulator or a capacitor-like assembly, then the question is no longer geological. It becomes technological. Who made it? How was it processed? What system required it? Official explanations drifted toward the familiar. Imported materials, unusual minerals, foreign manufacture, maritime reuse. But these explanations struggle with the same problem every conventional account seems to face. They explain isolated parts. They do not explain the pattern. A strange insulator can be dismissed. A strange tower can be dismissed. A strange conduit can be dismissed. But towers, conduits, chambers, grounding systems, insulators, and resonant structures recurring together beneath the bay begin to suggest a language, a technological language, one that appears coherent enough to have once served a real function, yet alien enough to evade every comfortable category available to the engineers who found it. The deeper crews pushed into the bay floor, the more the idea of ordinary harbor infrastructure seems to have become untenable. Some of the most haunting descriptions concern giant resonance towers, structures so symmetrical and so finely engineered that later labels like lighthouse foundations or pier supports feel strangely inadequate. These were said to contain internal coil mechanisms, amplification-like chambers, and base systems integrated into stone. Some may once have extended above the waterline before submersion or burial. Others appear to have been connected to surrounding installations through conduits no map fully preserved. Workers who saw them reportedly struggled to settle on a description. In private correspondence, some called them broadcast devices. Others simply admitted that they did not know what they were looking at. That admission matters, because uncertainty from ordinary observers is one thing. Uncertainty from experienced engineers is another. If trained men responsible for reclamation work, foundation assessment, and electrical coordination found themselves looking at structures they could recognize as purposeful but not classify as familiar, then the boundary between accepted history and buried anomaly had already been crossed. And then almost predictably, the burial resumed. This is one of the most important parts of the story. The dredging did not simply continue until the entire area was understood. Certain chambers were filled again. Certain bases were covered. Deep sections of the bay floor were isolated from further work. Officially, the explanation was practical structural stability schedule, pressure, exposition, deadlines, safe ground preparation. All of that sounds reasonable, but the pattern within those decisions is hard to ignore. Again and again, the installations that seem to have been reburied first were the ones containing the strangest components. The resonance towers, the unknown ceramics, the integrated grounding systems, the sealed chambers whose internal machinery most strongly defied ordinary classification. corroded debris could remain visible. The coherent anomalies disappeared fastest. That does not require a dramatic conspiracy to matter. It only requires a city under intense pressure to prioritize the future above the truth below. And when that happens, suppression can wear the face of efficiency. Burial can masquerade as engineering necessity. The unfamiliar can be covered not because everyone agrees what it means, but because no one wants to delay progress long enough to find out. By mid-1915, much of what had been exposed beneath the waterfront had reportedly been sealed beneath landfill exposition foundations or fresh layers of dredged sediment. The fair opened. Visitors arrived. Light architecture and pageantry filled the reclaimed ground above. And below that ground, another story remained, fragmented, dark, partly photographed, partly described, partly implied by the structures no longer shown. That is where the real unease begins. Because if the buried installations beneath San Francisco Bay were merely isolated relics of ordinary early infrastructure, then one would expect them to reinforce the public story. One would expect known manufacturers, known utilities, known construction methods, and known purposes to appear clearly in the record. But what survives instead suggests something stranger. A buried grid more unified than it should have been. A level of precision beyond what it should have required. Materials more advanced than the accepted timeline comfortably allows. Transmission forms that sound less like telegraphy and more like field-based power architecture. Grounding systems tied into geology rather than local structures. Installations aligned across wide sections of the shoreline as though they once belonged to a single, original plan. And once you let those details accumulate, the exposition itself begins to look different. Not just as a symbol of rebirth, but as a layer built over revelation. What if the reclaimed land did more than support pavilions? What if it also concealed evidence? What if the fairgrounds of 1915 rested on top of a pre-existing technological layer, too coherent, too precise, and too historically disruptive to be left exposed beneath the city's grand celebration of modern progress? That possibility is what gives the story its lasting power. Not certainty, not proof beyond dispute, but pressure. Pressure exerted by photographs, pressure exerted by alignment, pressure exerted by repeated understatement in the record, pressure exerted by installations that look less like scattered debris and more like the remains of a buried energy language. And once that pressure builds, San Francisco begins to look less like an isolated case and more like part of a larger pattern. Because cities do not just grow upward, they build over, they dredge over, they reclaim over, they convert inconvenient ground into useful surface. They turn buried systems into forgotten layers, and forgotten layers into foundations. What one generation calls development, another may mistake for origin. And somewhere beneath that process lies the missing grid. If the bay floor once held an energy network, if the resonance tower's conduits and transmission chambers were fragments of something larger, then the implications extend far beyond one exposition, one city, or one shoreline. They touch a much bigger question. How many harbors hide older installations beneath dredged fill? How many waterfronts were reshaped in ways that conveniently sealed what lay below? How many land reclamation projects presented as triumphs of engineering also served as permanent lids over infrastructure no accepted narrative could comfortably explain? In that sense, the mystery beneath San Francisco Bay is not only about 1915. It is about how history behaves when the ground itself refuses to cooperate with the story told above it. It is about what happens when modern progress uncovers older precision. It is about the choice every city eventually makes when confronted with an inconvenient layer beneath its own foundations. Investigate it fully, or build over it. San Francisco appears to have chosen the second path. The fare rose, the lights came on, the crowds arrived, the reclaimed ground became spectacle, and below the spectacle the grid went dark again, not completely erased, just buried deeply enough that public memory could move on without it. That is often how unsettling history survives, not in textbooks, not in monuments, but in gaps, in vanished images, in engineering notes that lose confidence as they go deeper, in foundations resting on something no one wants to name. For one brief moment in 1915, the bay opened. Workers looked down through the mud and found something too ordered to be random and too advanced to fit neatly into the electrical story of the age above it. They saw towers, chambers, conduits, insulators, and resonant systems that hinted at a form of transmission no archive was prepared to explain. Then the sediment returned. The foundations were set. The exposition began. And what had been exposed became something more dangerous than debris. It became implication. Because if modern San Francisco was built on top of a buried energy infrastructure, whose design exceeds the official story of early 20th century development, then the real mystery is not confined to one fare or one bay. The real mystery is how many other waterfronts conceal the same kind of silence. How many docks, how many harbors, how many bays, how many reclaimed coastlines cover chambers, grids, and transmission systems whose original purpose vanished from the record before anyone thought to preserve it. Maybe what the crews found was nothing more than misunderstood experimental equipment from a forgotten chapter of industrial history. Or maybe it was something else, something older, something inherited, something precise enough and integrated enough to make the accepted story feel less like history and more like a surface laid carefully over deeper ground. Either way, once you imagine those towers beneath the bay, once you imagine coils and grounded chambers hidden under landfill and exposition marble, it becomes difficult to see the waterfront the same way again. Because perhaps the exposition did not only celebrate recovery, perhaps for a brief moment, it also buried discovery. And perhaps beneath the shoreline, beneath the landfill, beneath the memory of lights and pavilions and polished facades, another map still exists. A lower map, a drowned map, a map of towers, chambers, conduits, and silent transmission structures resting in darkness beneath the city's official rebirth. Not gone, not destroyed, just covered, just renamed, just pressed beneath the line where history prefers not to look. And that may be the most unsettling possibility of all. That the real story of San Francisco's rise was not only written in the buildings above the bay, but in the grid buried below it. If this stayed with you, there are more harbors, cities, and buried systems where the ground may be hiding far more than history admits.